Tantor Audio presents To Marry an English Lord, Tales of Wealth and Marriage, Sex and Snobbery, by Gail McCall and Carol McD. Wallace. Narrated by Kate Redding. Yes, dance with him, lady, and bright as they are, believe us, he's worthy. Those sunshiny smiles, wave for him the flag of the stripe and the star, and gladden the heart of the Queen of the Isles. We thank you for all that has welcomed him most, for the sign of true love that you bear the old land. Proud heiress of all that his ancestor lost, you restore it in giving that warm, loving hand. Punch, 1860. Before the century is out, these clever and pretty women from New York will pull the strings in half the chanceries in Europe. Lord Palmerston, British Prime Minister. Prologue. On a bright fall day in 1860, 300,000 people, nearly half the population of New York City, stood jostling each other and craning their necks on either side of Broadway. They were waiting to catch a glimpse of the latest distinguished visitor to their metropolis, a slender, fair-haired 19-year-old who had captured the imagination of the populace. He was Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, and as his open barouche bowled down the street, the crowds cheered and waved their welcome. That was his greeting from the democratic masses. The upper-class welcome was fancier, though no less hysterical. A banquet had been proposed, but this idea was dimly received by the prince's suite. His Royal Highness had just left Canada, where he had been to so many banquets. He was awfully fond of dancing. Could there not be a ball to welcome him to New York? So a ball there was. The Select Planning Committee faced the invidious task of deciding just who in New York society was worthy of meeting the Prince of Wales. Never had there been such grovelling, such angling, such pleading for invitations. And when on the night of October 12, the 4,000 chosen people succeeded in fitting themselves into the Academy of Music, another 1,000 unchosen succeeded in joining them. The floor promptly collapsed, just as His Royal Highness was about to make his entrance, so the guests had to spend 2 hours milling around examining each other's toilettes, the Rhinelander emeralds, Mrs. Gardner's silver and coral dress from Worth, the new Paris dressmaker, as a swarm of carpenters made an ungodly racket, hammering beneath them. The floor was repaired, the ball began, and though his dancing partners had been carefully chosen in advance, the prince was mobbed by women, prim, well-bred Victorian ladies who would not let him alone. "Not in strict accordance with good breeding," sniffed the Duke of Newcastle, H.R.H.'s chaperone. The prince did not seem to mind. It was the prince's first exposure to American women. His enthusiasm for them and their reciprocal feelings for him would have a profound effect on English society for the next 50 years. Chapter 1. The Buccaneers, Old New York. The dozen years that passed after the Prince of Wales's visit to New York brought the Civil War and profound changes in the economy of America. But New York's social patterns remained unruffled. For most of the 19th century, the city's society was simple, comprising the families that had been there forever. They were known as knickerbockers, after the knee-length trousers worn by early Dutch settlers from whom many of them were descended. In fact, New York's social leaders could, with the sole addition of large neck ruffs, have posed convincingly for portraits of 17th-century burghers. Conservatism, thrift, hard work, and modesty ruled the day. The men were bankers or lawyers or heirs to mercantile concerns. Some of them had tidy fortunes produced by increasingly valuable Manhattan real estate. But however rich they might be, Knickerbocker families were never showy. The rows of brownstones between Washington Square and Gramercy Park were virtually uniform, with square parlors and suites of rosewood furniture and 3 sets of curtains at each window. On the dining-room table was family silver, thin and worn from generations of use, and Chinese export porcelain. A maid would serve dinner and dust the knickknacks, a cook would manage the unadorned roasts, and a coachman with a single horse would convey the family to the opera. The Knickerbocker way of life. Social occasions were also simple. Weddings often took place at home, followed by a wedding breakfast. A young girl's debut, when she was formally presented to society, i.e. to her parents' friends, involved little more than donning a white dress, putting up her hair, and receiving guests at a tea. Later she could accompany her parents to evening parties, where the entertainment included parlor games for the young people and cards for the grown-ups, with a bowl of punch and some shredded ham to punctuate the festivities. Dances meant rugs rolled back, furniture pushed to the wall, and a willing spinster pounding away on the piano. Ballrooms, in those days, were unheard of. It was a stable way of life, and a secure one. The debutante, daydreaming in the dark parlor, could easily envision her future. 2 or 3 seasons of paying calls with Mamma, looking at albums of Venice with young men at parties, blushingly sharing a hymnal at church, having her hand pressed meaningfully on the dance floor, a proposal, and marriage to an upstanding young banker or lawyer, her own brownstone on a side street, and managing the house and children. Being a matron and wearing elegant dark colors, perhaps even, if she'd chosen the right young banker, dresses from Paris, though they would have to lie unworn in trunks for a season or 2 to be right for New York. A Knickerbocker woman should not be too fashionable. A box for the opera at the Academy of Music, possibly a summer cottage, and in time a debutante daughter of her own, looking at albums of Venice with her best friend's son. If life in old New York was dull and predictable, the Knickerbocker families liked it that way. But this Eden of the bourgeoisie couldn't last. In the 1860s, a whole new group of people began making money in industry, in armaments, in railroads, in preserved meats to feed the soldiers, in harvesters that freed workers from the fields. These enterprises made a lot of men very rich, very fast, and when they got rich, they came to New York. Worlds in collision. A fortune of only $1 million is respectable poverty. Ward McAllister. That New York was the social citadel, nobody doubted. Boston had evolved its own peculiar intellectual and sumptuary restrictions that took all the fun out of the high society game. Philadelphia had been left behind by commerce, and commercial money provided the new blood that kept the competition sharp. Washington, ever since the early emphatic separation of politics from society, America was the only country in the world where having been born in a log cabin could be construed as a political advantage, was a backwater. So, wherever money was made and social aspiration followed, New York was the acknowledged great good place. And though New Yorkers had known this for generations, they were taken aback by the sudden mass-market appeal of their hitherto quiet city. Suddenly there were new carriages on the drives in Central Park. New faces appeared in the stalls at the Academy of Music, but not in the boxes, for these were handed from one generation to another. New names were heard on husbands' lips in connection with business downtown. Naturally enough, these new people thought they might like to take part in the social life of New York. If the Knickerbocker menfolk could do business with the husbands, couldn't the Knickerbocker ladies call on the wives? The answer was, absolutely not, and nothing could make them. For New York society was run by women, and they were implacable in their distaste for new people. These arrivistes had no business upsetting the quiet, dignified, family-oriented city of pre-war days. And they were so showy. Their womenfolk, for instance, were capable of wearing Paris dresses the instant the trunks from Worth cleared customs. These new people, with their new money still gritty from the mines or tacky with shoe polish, knew nothing of culture or manners, and certainly nothing of restraint. Why, August Belmont, who had married the perfectly respectable Caroline Perry, owned a gold-plated dinner service. Wasn't China good enough? And what was the use of all that fancy French cooking when a brace of canvas-back duck had kept gentlemen happy for decades? Clearly, something had to be done before these nouveaux riches achieved a critical mass, and the sedate refinements of old New York were lost forever in a welter of ostentation. The cut direct. Definition. A social technique designed to express disapproval, reinforce superiority, demonstrate exclusivity, a very public snubbing. For reasons that you and I and everyone watching us comprehend, I do not choose to acknowledge your existence, despite our having met at tea, gone to finishing school together, been bridesmaids at each other's weddings. The victims. Outsiders. Either unsavory social climbers or former insiders who have let down the side. The technique. Choose the most public place available. A ballroom, the Opera House, or Fifth Avenue. Make sure your intended victim sees you. Establish eye contact if possible. Wait for a sign of acknowledgement. A nod, a raised hand, a smile. This is important. If the victim ignores you, she may feel she has been the cutter and you the cuttee. Approach and sail past, stony-faced, as if the individual were not there. Do not look back to revel in discomfiture. That would be rude. Knobs versus swells. At this time, Knickerbocker society was led by Mrs. William Backhouse Astor, widely known as the Mrs. Astor, and she was seconded in her task of keeping order by a self-important Southerner named Ward McAllister. A man to whom social nuance was the very bread of life, McAllister came up with a grand idea for coping with the onslaught of new people. He organized a group called the Patriarchs, 25 New Yorkers, who would give 3 balls each season beginning in the winter of 1872. Each patriarch could invite 4 ladies and 5 gentlemen as his guests, vouching for their social acceptability. The goal was to redefine society so that anyone consistently invited to the balls would be clearly in. The brilliance of the plan lay in McAllister's selection of the patriarchs. They were carefully chosen to form a new social elite, representing not only the knobs, the old oligarchy, but the swells, the high-living possessors of new money. The coalition would, McAllister thought, create an unchallenged and unchallengeable hierarchy. He expected that once they were assimilated into the chosen people, the swells would hasten to align themselves against their former fellows and step on the hands of the climbers just below them on the ladder. McAllister's calculations left out, however, a distinctive feature of American society. There's always new money. Even the apparent codification of New York society in the Patriarchs' balls couldn't solve the problem of the nouveau riche forever. They kept coming to Manhattan, richer and richer, and more insistent on social recognition. So, to strengthen their defenses, the anointed demanded the correct ways of doing things. From leaving calling cards to marrying off a daughter, they made lists, guest lists, visiting lists, members' lists, and New York society by the mid-1870s was more self-consciously exclusive and compulsively regimented than ever. The Mrs. Astor. Ward McAllister may have done the actual work of drawing up lists, scrutinizing the merits of debutantes and leading cotillions, but he was just an eager worker bee carrying out the commands of his queen, Mrs. Astor. Born Caroline Schermerhorn of an old shipping family, Mrs. Astor was uniquely suited to the task of running New York. Her husband was the wealthy William Backhouse Astor, Jr. She made him drop his middle name because it was vulgar, whose money was some 50 years older than bouncer money and thus acceptable. In addition, she had the pride and strength of purpose to keep society pure of newcomers. Tall, dark-haired, and commanding, she breezed through the city's social rituals with the confidence of a woman who had rarely, in her 40 years, been crossed. The crucial question in New York was whether or not Mrs. Astor knew you. Had she spoken to you at a tea party? Had she paid a call? It was always up to a social superior to make the first visit. Most important, had she invited you to her annual ball? If not, you'd best leave town or sit at home in the dark, lest anyone know of your shame. Even among those who did gain entree to the sacred precinct, favorites were singled out still further. The queen of society had a throne, a red velvet divan set upon a dais, from which she watched the dancing. The truly chosen were fetched to sit with her for a few breathless moments, and everyone knew them as the elect. Rule Britannia. New money and new faces, the same forces that were convulsing old New York, were finding a far different reception in London. Society here was not threatened by newcomers. Instead, it welcomed the glamour and opulence the newcomers could bring. This reception had much to do with the fact that London society's commander-in-chief was not a persnickety matron, but a party-loving playboy who happened to be next in line for the British throne. Wretched, high-born beings. Though christened Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales would be known throughout his life by the jaunty nickname Bertie. The party-loving playboy was, of course, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. In 1861, a year after the prince's tour of North America, his father had died, leaving his mother the Queen quite inconsolable. Victoria had depended on her husband not only as head of the family, they had 9 children, but as her chief, most reliable adviser on affairs of state. In fact, her entire existence had centered on her straight-backed, right-thinking consort. "My life as a happy one is ended," she mourned. "The world is gone for me." For her eldest son, however, life was just beginning. In the spring of 1863, Bertie married a pretty 18-year-old Danish princess named Alexandra. For taking this step into responsible adulthood, he was rewarded with Marlborough House, his own London residence. Soon afterward he bought Sandringham, a country estate in Norfolk. Now the 22-year-old prince could entertain whom he pleased, as he pleased. So he chose to entertain people like Louisa, Duchess of Manchester, who, Victoria warned Alexandra, is not a fit companion for you, and the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland, she being, according to Victoria, a foolish, injudicious little woman whose husband did not live as a duke ought. Bertie and Alex had fallen in with the fashionable set, and the fashionable set, so long denied royal favour, was delighted to have them. While Albert was alive, sobriety, simplicity, domesticity, and respect for the hard-working lower orders had been the hallmarks of royal style. Queen Victoria and Albert could never really be bothered with events of the social season, such as Ascot or Derby Day. Their view of fashionable society was not far different from that of the Knickerbocker crowd in New York, who tended to consider aristocratic a synonym for decadent. In fact, the royal pair had nothing but disdain for the free-living nobility, the wretched, ignorant, high-born beings, as Victoria described them, who live only to kill time. Bertie takes off. Though grief-stricken, Queen Victoria continued to keep a firm grip on the reins of power, and, despite her own minister's advice that she give her son something serious to occupy his mind, she denied him any responsible occupation, even something as innocuous as the presidency of the Society of Arts. The Prince of Wales, a restless, energetic, enthusiastic young man, who liked nothing so much as a diary crammed full of engagements, was thus left with little else to do in life but have fun. In pursuit of this goal, he quite naturally began to emulate those masters of purposeful leisure, the English aristocracy. He took up horse-racing, hunting, shooting. He played cards for money until early in the morning. He gambled at casinos when he went abroad. He attended balls and teas. He went to Ascot, not just on opening day, but every day, driving onto the course with his friends in a glittering carriage procession. He also went to music halls, and after the theatre he went to Rule's or the Café Royal or Kettner's, restaurants that provided not only meals, but private rooms with settees for postprandial sex. Moreover, as all England eventually came to know, the prince did not confine his extramarital lust to showgirls in the upstairs rooms of restaurants. The first big scandal of his career broke in 1870, when Sir Charles Mordaunt sued his young wife for divorce. Harriet Mordaunt's solicitor countersued, claiming she was not of sound mind. A packet of letters from the prince to Harriet was entered as evidence, and he was subpoenaed to give testimony. So, for the first time in English history, a Prince of Wales entered the witness box at a public trial. Bertie acquitted himself well. He managed to sound convincing as he denied that he had committed no improper familiarity or criminal act, but the damage was done. The prince was clearly not the paragon of domestic virtue his parents had raised him to be. Outside in. There was irony in this, for Bertie's entire upbringing had been meticulously designed by his father to produce an exemplar of the modern monarchy. Albert was far-sighted enough to realize that monarchs at the end of the 19th century would not be allowed to get away with the kind of behavior that had distinguished the Regency years. The threat of revolution was not to be taken lightly. Republican sentiments were being voiced loudly and regularly. The licentious behavior of monarchs and their noble friends in other European countries had already cost them their heads. Albert wanted to make sure that the prince kept his. To this end, young Bertie had been allowed as little contact with the English aristocracy as his father could politely manage. The corrupting influence of British patrician frivolity must not spread to the boy. So the prince was presented with carefully chosen companions, vetted and approved by Albert. He spent his youth surrounded by older men and tutors, who were supposed to report back regularly to his father. He was always being watched, expected to be reading and studying, rarely allowed to play. He was not allowed to attend Eton, and while he followed some courses at Oxford, he was forbidden to have any part in undergraduate life there. Although Albert's plan was bound to backfire, Bertie's childhood seclusion had at least one beneficial result. Having been raised outside the traditional English system, he was without some of the traditional English prejudices. He himself wasn't altogether English. His father was German, he had 3 German grandparents, and there was a distinct Germanic flavor in his pronunciation of certain English words. So why should he mind if some of his friends weren't classic English aristocrats? If a wealthy, amusing man like Alfred Rothschild was willing to host the prince and his entourage, the prince was willing to give him social entree. All manner of strange, wild millionaires were wandering round London then, recalled Christopher Sykes, and the prince, perhaps recognizing natural devil-mates, yearned to make these men his friends. In other words, the Prince of Wales willingly counted among his companions the very sort of recently rich, big-spending industrialists who were giving old New York an upset stomach. The Rock of England. The prince's taste for expensive entertainment, his enthusiasm for the social round, and his willingness to call in from the social wilderness those previously without hope, as long as they were amusing and could pay their way, converged with London's growing position as the centre of a far-flung empire. By the 1870s, social climbers, not merely from the rest of England, but from all over the world, had begun to arrive in London. But London's society matrons, unlike their New York counterparts, were not coming unglued at the prospect. Revolutions they worried about, social climbers they could deal with, without needing recourse to McAllister's lists and patriarch's balls. They already had an ancient and noble system for keeping people sorted out, for deciding who ultimately was socially acceptable. They had the British peerage. And unlike the nobility of the fallen European monarchies, the British peerage was still in fighting trim. For one thing, it hadn't lost control of Parliament. The peers themselves sat in the House of Lords, while their sons and untitled friends sat in the House of Commons. For another, thanks to the policy of primogeniture, the titles and estates of the British peers had remained more or less intact. Primogeniture meant that the eldest son in a noble family got everything: the land, the houses, the paintings, the jewels, the titles. This way, the title proliferation that afflicted the French and Italian aristocracies was not a problem in England. In France, there might be several Comtes de Castellane running around at any one time. In England, there were only 27 dukes, and a duke had to die before his son could take his place. Linked with primogeniture was the policy of entail, a means of tying up estates in trust, so that they were not broken up into ever smaller plots of land, but passed whole from one generation to the next. Ruthless, but wise. This system, though hard on the daughters and younger sons who lost by it, gave the English titles, and consequently the entire English aristocracy, a certain irrevocable cachet. Because England's social structure was so explicit, and because it was agreed on by everyone, non-aristocrats included, society could be more relaxed. Status had already been determined by title and family history, and little short of outright scandal could alter it. While New York, in its effort to be exclusive, was becoming ever duller, London was on its way to becoming the most brilliant social capital of the era. And, fortunately for American heiresses, this capital's social leader was the Prince of Wales, a man who had already proved that he had an open mind as far as outsiders were concerned, and a more than keen eye for the ladies. Their noble lordships. Without an up-to-date peerage listing all titled Britons and their families, the task of sorting out the nobility was next to impossible. Adding to the difficulty was the fact that the upper ranks of the English aristocracy often had several titles, of which they would use only the highest. The ranks into
Sample complete. Ready to continue?